Good afternoon or good morning, depending on which part of the Atlantic you're sitting on today. Delighted to have you today to join us for a book talk on Qatar and the Gulf Crisis, sponsored by the Gulf International Forum. The book is authored by Dr. Kristian Ulrichsen, a Baker Institute Fellow for the Middle East, previously worked as a senior Gulf analyst at the Gulf Center for Strategic Studies, and was director of the Kuwait program on development, governance, and globalization at the London School of Economics. Currently, he is a non-resident fellow at the Gulf International Forum. Before proceeding, I'd like to give you a little bit of housekeeping notes. Please write your questions on the Q&A box as early as possible. Give me some time to review them and then pass them on to Dr. Ulrichsen. This is I just gotten a copy of the book, an extremely interesting book on where the Gulf crisis has taken us. And Dr. Ulrichsen is here to tell us about what happened and where it seems to be going. Dr. Ulrichsen, welcome. And could you please start? We'll have about 15 minutes for you to provide an overview of your book, and then we will have an opportunity for a discussion and questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Ferris, and thank you everyone for tuning in. Why is a book about a Gulf crisis, another Gulf crisis, important? After all, as I point out in the book, we've seen a succession of clashes of points of tension between Qatar and some of its neighbors, including the UAE and Abu Dhabi in particular, Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, that go back not just to 2017, to the beginning of the current and ongoing blockade, embargo, boycott. What you will call it depends on the stance you take of Qatar, but also going back, say, to 2014, when we had a first iteration of this current crisis, when Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the UAE withdrew their ambassadors from Doha for a period of 9 months. We could go back to 1996, when the same three countries plus Egypt, as in the same countries now the anti-Qatar quartet, were implicated in an attempt to reinstate the former Emir of Qatar, who had been replaced the previous year by the father Emir, the father of the current Emir, Sheikh Tamim. We could even go back until the 1930s to periods of Saudi-Qatari border friction, or even to 1992 when there was a border clash between the Saudi and Qatari forces, or even back to the 1860s, where I actually begin the book in 1867, when the sheikhs of Abu Dhabi and Bahrain joined together to effectively sack what was then the villages of Doha and Al-Waqra on the coastline. And so we can go back a long way, but why is this most recent crisis important? Well, to some extent, it's because it's the deepest and longest lasting rupture in Gulf politics since 1990, since the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. We've not, thankfully, had a similar military component to this crisis, although there were many in Qatar who believed that there was something military that was planned. I've never been able to pin down what it might have been, although I will note that the Emir of Kuwait in September 2017, in a press conference with Donald Trump at the White House, did say, thanks God, what was stopped was military action. And for someone of Sheikh Sabah's experience as a diplomat of 60 years standing, where everything he says is carefully calibrated and thought through, for him to say something like that was not just a kind of a casual aside. So it's the biggest fissure in Gulf politics for a generation. It also coincidentally happened 50 years to the day since the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. And that redefined the politics of the Middle East for a generation. And this crisis has also begun to redefine and also to realign some of the politics within the Gulf. The Gulf Cooperation Council, created in 1981, it commemorated its 39th anniversary just this week, has really struggled to recohere and to maintain relevance in the last 3 years. And until 2017, the GCC was one of the more durable examples of a regional organization in the Arab world. So it's had implications. It's been important in that respect. It's also important because it's the first 6 months of the Donald Trump administration in Washington. And that, I think, has a crucial role as well. We look back at those first 6 months, a lot of what happened before, during, and after the inauguration has become entangled in so many different inquiries. Think of the Mueller investigation into foreign interference or allegations of foreign interference. Think of Kellyanne Conway's expression alternative facts to describe the crowds at the inauguration. And I would argue that the Qatar blockade is an example of alternative facts in regional and international relations. It's the first international crisis of the alternative facts era. After all, this began within the first 6 months of the administration. It began with a hack and the implementation of a fake news story designed to create an impression that the Qatari leadership was out of kilter with its regional neighbors and out of kilter with the consensus of the close Gulf partners with the United States. And that led to an echo chamber of 2 weeks of negative news stories right before the blockade, including also conferences and media coverage in the US that was clearly designed to lay the groundwork for portraying Qatar as this sort of black sheep of the region that somehow needs to be taken down a notch and brought under control. And so very much an attempt to shape the narrative, both between the hack in May 2017, the blockade in June, and then also since then as well, where we've seen media and social media really being used as tools within this crisis of competing narratives. We also see the implications of this crisis on the peoples within the Gulf, peoples, societies, communities, whereas previous issues, like the 2014 diplomatic spat, which involved the withdrawal of ambassadors, didn't affect individual people, community, and society. Whereas the blockade, the suspension of travel, the fact that families, especially the part of the world where cross-border connections are so much more prevalent than, say, in other parts of the world, this had an immediate and an ongoing impact, which meant that the crisis was felt at individual level, and it wasn't just a crisis of elites, it was a crisis of the peoples too. And this, I would argue, is going to make it more difficult to fully get over this crisis if and when there's ever any resolution, because it's not going to be as easy as just signing an agreement, as was, for example, done in 2014, that the elites can agree to, because this has created memories that will be harder to wash away and to sort of get over, at least in the short and potentially immediate term. It's also important in the view of, since 1990, there has been a view in the Gulf, among the smaller Gulf states, but also in Saudi Arabia, that in times of need, if any of the Gulf states was threatened, it would be the United States that would come to their assistance. Ever since the invasion of Kuwait and the US-led rapid mobilization of the coalition to liberate Kuwait in the Gulf War, a core element of the Gulf states' security and defense strategy has been the assumption that they can call upon the US to defend themselves if they need it. And in 2017, because President Trump chose to issue a set of 3 tweets on the day after the blockade was announced, which appeared to endorse the blockade, to label Qatar a supporter of terrorism at the highest level, and to draw a link to discussions he claimed to have had in Riyadh in May 2017, that caused shockwaves, not just in Doha, but I would argue it caused shockwaves in all Gulf capitals, especially in Kuwait, in Oman, who were also unwilling to take sides, because suddenly the notion that the US would be on your side if you needed US support was called into question. And the fact that the Turkish parliament then met the day after Trump's tweets and accelerated the ratification of 2 agreements that allowed Turkish troops to be deployed in Doha means that, in the view of many, it wasn't the US that stepped in June 2017 to prevent any escalation. It was another actor, in this case Turkey. And in a part of the world which has been defined since at least the mid-1980s, definitely since 1990, by the close security, defense, and political network of ties between the US and its regional partners, to have one of these regional partners seemingly thrown under the bus, albeit only temporarily, as it turned out, was a big deal. And of course, the response in Doha was to really reach out to all aspects of the US government to try and make sure that the Qatari-US relationship was more than just about one man. But of course, we also saw pushback immediately from the Secretaries of State and Defense, who pushed back against Donald Trump straight away against the White House, who were probably more fully aware of the economic, political, defense, and energy relationships partnerships between Qatar and the US, especially Secretary of State Rex Tillerson at his time at Exxon, and Exxon has obviously been a critical partner of Qatar in energy. And Secretary of State Jim Mattis had been former head of CENTCOM, which has its forward headquarters in Doha. So you saw kind of a schism within the US government as well, which closed by September 2017, when it became apparent that the White House and the president now supported a resolution. But it's been harder to put that into practice. In a sense, the sort of breach that opened up between May, June, and September 2017, the sort of the genie that's been let out of the bottle, is now harder to put back in. The US cannot simply wish the crisis would go away, even though in the eyes of some of the quartet of states that took this measure, they had hoped and perhaps even assumed that their campaign of outreach to the White House especially would have drawn at least White House support. And that for me is one of the conundrums, one of the sort of, why did they think, why was there a view in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi that if the White House would flip, the rest of the US government would flip with it? And to me, the response, the question, that's an interesting question. That I would think the only answer is that actually the White House and the Trump administration, if you remember, they came into office loudly proclaiming that they were going to do things their way. If you remember to the way the initial travel ban was rolled out on the very first week of the administration's time in office in January 2017, remember Stephen Miller, for example, almost shouting at the media, saying, we're in power, we're in charge, we're doing things our way. It could just be that the Saudis and Emiratis especially bought into the notion that this was a new political game, that the Trump administration was somehow resetting the rules of doing things. And of course, we've now seen over the past 3 years the institutional pushback. Institutions are being stress tested, to be sure, but there has been pushback at almost every level, especially when policies have been abrupt and so obviously out of sync with previous US positions. So it has implications on that respect as well. The fact that in 2013, the initial period of pressure on Qatar that led to the 2014 iteration of this crisis began within 2 or 3 weeks of the handover of power from Emir Hamad to Emir Tamim, has also concerned people in other Gulf states, especially Kuwait and Oman, that were facing and still facing Kuwait's case, succession of their own, would pressure on a new leader to toe a particular geopolitical line be applied in future, as it seems to have been applied in 2013, try and get the Qataris to move away from some of the policies associated with Sheikh Hamad and sort of the leadership around him between 2011 and 2013. So the implications on the regional level, this crisis has hit the GCC at one of its weakest points, which is that the GCC is a collection of one large state, Saudi Arabia, and 5 smaller ones. Saudi Arabia is 7 times larger than Oman, which itself is bigger than the other 4 Gulf states put together. And there's always been a degree of concern among the smaller Gulf states, including the UAE, that the GCC would become Saudi top-heavy, or that Gulf politics would see the Saudis especially throwing their weight around. And so now we have an alignment between Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi, between the Crown Princes, Mohammed bin Salman, Mohammed bin Zayed, doing just that. It really kind of plays on some of the issues that have really prevented the GCC and the Gulf states from coming together in a closer form of union over the last decades, out of concern that the imbalance of size and conventional power might not be in their interests. Qatar has responded, and I go into this in the book, in a variety of ways. To some extent, the 2014 iteration of the crisis gave an inkling that something might happen again. There was, to some extent, 3 years of contingency planning, of preparation, at least of imagining what might happen if something were to recur. So there was a degree of market planning, of thinking about how to restructure trade routes if necessary. There was also infrastructure development. And Hamad Port in Qatar opened in 2016, became fully operational in 2017. Had the blockade happened in 2014, had the withdrawal of the ambassadors coincided with the blockade of air and sea traffic, that would have had real consequences for Qatar, because in 2014, before Hamad Port opened, 85% of imports that came in by sea had to go through Jebel Ali in Dubai first, and it was loaded from large cargo ocean-going ships onto smaller ships that went up to Qatar, whereas Hamad Port allowed Qatar to receive directly these large cargo ships for the first time, and to bypass Jebel Ali in Dubai, to bypass any intermediary. So infrastructure development, I think, was critical as well. Diversifying relationships, again, a realization that you cannot have all your eggs in one basket. You might think the relationship with one partner, in this case the US, is rock solid, but actually it might not be. And I would argue that for the Saudis and Emiratis, that moment of realization came 2 years later in September 2019, when, after the attack on Iraqi and Kuwait on Saudi oil facilities, the Trump administration effectively did nothing. The Trump administration showed in 2019 it was willing and prepared to respond when US assets were hit, as in the shooting down of a US drone in June 2017 and the death of an American contractor in Iraq in December, but not when its Gulf partners' assets were hit, as in the attacks in May and June on shipping, and then September. So just as the Qataris realized in 2017 that actually this relationship might not be as strong as and enduring as one might have thought, it's better to diversify and to have a balance of relationships. For the Saudis and Emiratis, that moment of reckoning, I think, came in 2019. So that has implications as well for the future of the US position in the region. And then just finally, the battle of narratives. I talked about narratives at the beginning in shaping or trying to shape the context for the blockade that was eventually launched. And the Qataris were very successful in reframing the narrative, in casting Qatar as the victim of a kind of a power play, of kind of a play of two larger, more conventionally powerful states intent on getting their own way in the region, of trying to strap the Qataris and potentially also other states into a geopolitical straitjacket where you follow us or there'll be consequences. And we saw that as well in the list of 12 demands, together with the 13th demand that the list be complied with within 10 days. We saw very strongly then an attempt to impose on Qatar a kind of geopolitical straitjacket that again has implications for Kuwait and for Oman, those other two Gulf states that have had relatively autonomous regional policies as well, especially vis-a-vis Iran. So this attempt to kind of redefine Gulf politics along an axis from Riyadh to Abu Dhabi, a more exclusionary access, compared with the more inclusionary vision of the Gulf Cooperation Council, has also had implications. The GCC continues to exist. It has lost a lot of its luster over the last 3 years. Some of the summits have broken up. It's now more a technocratic system of committees that talk about kind of apolitical and technocratic issues. So it continues, but in a much more diminished form. And finally, from a US perspective, Donald Trump went to Riyadh in May 2017, and he called on the Sunni Arab world, and especially US partners in the Sunni Arab states, to come together against ISIS and Iran. But within 2 days, we had the hack, and effectively the Sunni Arab states in the Gulf fell on each other. And that has continued to hamper the administration's attempt to contain or at least combat, as it sees, the threat from Iran, and continues to really undermine the maximum pressure campaign the administration has really tried and unsuccessfully tried to impose. And so I think the main message from the Gulf crisis has been that actually, unlike, say, the US and Iran, where from a US perspective there's a good side and a bad side, in this side there's no good and bad from a US perspective. And I think that's been made very clear to the White House in the last 3 years, albeit that it had to go through a very steep learning curve between June and September 2017, whose consequences are still being felt today. So with that, I'll pass back to Ambassador Fellows.
Fascinating subject, one that I lived partly. I was, as you remember, ambassador in Qatar at the time of the February 1996 attempted coup. Going a little bit beyond the relationship between the two countries, I should say, within the GCC, between Qatar and its neighbors, has this changed Qatar's perception of the outside world? I mean, did any other outside powers beside Turkey play a role in helping Qatar resist? I'm thinking particularly about Iran. I heard stories that the Iranians delivered messages in some of the in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi that their own interests were at stake. Did China do anything? Did Russia do anything? Is there any information about that?
Well, it was very instructive that within hours of Donald Trump's tweets, the Russian President Vladimir Putin called Emir Tamim. And I mean, this is, again, not necessarily something strategic. It's just a kind of Russian tactic, I think, of trying to take advantage of any potential cracks that appear in this wedge of US interests in a particular part of the world. We've seen that also in the European Union as well. The Russians will not miss an opportunity to try and widen any cracks that they see in the sort of web of relationships that the US has built around the world. It's what's been remarkable about the kind of attempt to isolate Qatar as well has been how few other states kind of supported it. I mean, this has also been a factor in its failure. Initially, there were a certain number of states which downgraded ties, Jordan, Senegal, Chad, and obviously the Yemeni government, which is based in Saudi Arabia, and Khalifa Haftar's unrecognized statelet in eastern Libya. But by 2018, a year into the crisis, Jordanians, the Senegalese, the Chadians all restored those ties, and there had been no additional buy-in to the campaign to isolate Qatar. So it very quickly became clear that no other state was willing to sign on to this narrative that Qatar was somehow a bad actor. In terms of assistance, well, obviously there's been a lot of trade that has come through Iran, trade from Turkey, trade from Azerbaijan, from Central Asia, would transit Iran on their way to Qatar. The kind of restructuring of land routes would have come from, say, Jordan through Saudi Arabia. Qatar Airways has had to redirect its flight paths, which again has been over Iranian airspace. And again, this has been frustrating to the US because at a time when the US is trying to rally its Gulf partners against Iran, here we have one Gulf partner being almost forced to actually increase a certain level of economic interdependency just because it lacks that on the other end. China continues to trade with Qatar. The Chinese, as in all of their Gulf relationships, I think have made it very clear that they will not take sides in political and geopolitical debates. They balance relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran, for example. And we're seeing the same thing in India. In fact, several people in India have been quite critical of this attempt to try and get them to take sides and to force them to choose. And there's actually been quite an interesting debate in Singapore as well. And in Singapore, there was an immediate debate about what had happened. And it was cast in the frame of this is the threat that small states surrounded by larger and conventionally more powerful states do face. And so there was an immediate relevance to Singapore of the attempt to really have that power play on Qatar in 2017. And then from a European perspective, the Qataris very quickly were able to, well, there was no European buy-in to the blockade, and then Qatar also, I think, redoubled its security and defense ties with the UK, France, and to some extent Germany as well, which just meant that there was no additional momentum to try to really isolate Qatar, not just regionally, but also internationally.
Following up on that, could you elaborate a bit more on Turkey's motivations for rather dramatically coming to Qatar's defense, and what this has meant for Qatar in the Mediterranean with Turkey?
Well, from a Turkish point of view, what happened in Doha in May, June 2017 was almost reminiscent of what had happened in Turkey in July 2016, when there had been an attempt to oust the President Erdogan, an attempt to do an abortive coup, call it what you will. And certainly in the Turkish media, there were reports accusing the UAE of not necessarily being directly involved, but certainly implicated in some way. And certainly in UAE and Egypt, media supporting the attempt to oust Erdogan. So from a Turkish point of view, there was a lot of similarity between July 2016 and then June 2017. This attempt by two very assertive regional states, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, to weaken and potentially also to isolate Qatar and Turkey, two states that followed perhaps a different approach to regional affairs. And so I think from a Turkish point of view, the fact that the Qatari Emir had been perhaps, I think, the first leader to contact Erdogan in 2016 to offer him his support after the coup attempt, it was very much reciprocated in June 2017. And the fact that Qatar and Turkey were sort of standing together against this attempt by the Saudis and Emiratis to really force through their vision of regional affairs, which, as we've seen in Libya especially, has directly pitted Turkey against the UAE in terms of support for groups on the ground. And so we've definitely seen a widening of a kind of a fault line and a split between that sort of Saudi Emirati axis on the one side, the Turkish-Qatari alignment on the other, which has, again, had implications in the Mediterranean, it's had implications in Libya. It's certainly causing a lot of ill feeling in debates about Yemen, where there were accusations and counter-accusations flying around. And again, it's a kind of rerunning of that sort of Arab Cold War notion of the 1960s and 70s, where you have these sort of very different poles within the Arab world, with sort of alignments and kind of sub-alignments between them. And certainly Qatar and Turkey are now very closely identified on the one side, with the Saudis and Emiratis on the other.
Thank you. Well, one last question leading up, before we turn to the audience, leading up to the motivations for this. Gareth Smith asks, does your research suggest that the issue of the Muslim Brotherhood played a major role, or was it just I'm paraphrasing the question, did it play a major role in the calculations of the UAE and Saudi Arabia, or was it more in the nature of let's find an excuse to go after the Qataris?
It's certainly the case that Abu Dhabi, especially, when we talk about the UAE, we really talk about Abu Dhabi as being the kind of defining driver of animosity towards Qatar. I mean, Dubai has been much more low-key. In fact, the ruler of Dubai has almost said nothing about the blockade since 2017. But certainly, Abu Dhabi has had a diametrically opposed view of what it sees as an existential threat from the Muslim Brotherhood and from Islamism. And that drove its policies in and after the Arab Spring as well, when The Qataris were more relaxed about the pace and direction of change in the states that had undergone political transition in 2011. They were more relaxed about Islamist groups winning elections, as they did, for example, in Egypt. Whereas from an Abu Dhabi perspective, this was a security threat domestically and also regionally that had to be countered, and not just countered, but actively rolled back. And so from an Abu Dhabi perspective, the Brotherhood was critical in the way it redefined and assessed threats to the UAE. In 2014, again, you saw demands made by the states that withdrew the ambassadors. And actually, the Qataris on that occasion actually made a series of concessions, which included relocating a number of Egyptian Muslim brothers who had actually managed to escape the crackdown in Egypt after Sisi's regime came to power in 2013. A number of the Brotherhood figures had gone to Doha, and it seemed as if they were beginning to meet again to plan what they might do next. And those meetings were made public in November 2013. And that was around that time that the beginning of the row began, when King Abdullah in Saudi Arabia summoned Sheikh Tamim for a showdown meeting. It was right around the time that it seemed that some of the figures from the Brotherhood were relocating and trying to reorganize. But the Qataris, as one of their concessions made in 2014, relocated them to Istanbul. Some also went to London. So there were concessions made. So I think by 2017, the UAE especially, and Mohammed bin Zayed, saw an opportunity with the Trump administration coming in to influence that administration to throw its weight behind policies favorable to the UAE, and especially by pressing the buttons that they knew would receive a sympathetic hearing in Washington, i.e. playing up the Brotherhood issue and playing up the Iranian issue as well. And that would almost sort of preach to the converted among a set of actors coming into office in the White House who lacked a lot of the expertise and experience in international affairs and in government affairs that you would normally associate with an incoming presidential administration. And actually, Ben Rhodes, who was on Obama's National Security Council for both Obama's terms, actually said in 2018 that a lot of the problems we're seeing now in the world, not just the Middle East, were things that we tried to stop happening when we, Obama's administration, were in office. And so you got and then he actually specifically mentioned the Qatar blockade as one example. And so you got the impression that there had been pressure even in 2014, maybe from the UAE especially, on the Obama administration to act and to do something about Qatar. Clearly that was pushed back at that time, but maybe in 2017 there was a feeling that the Trump administration would not only not push back, but would actively be sympathetic to this attempt to take action in that way.
Hi. It is very clear that the Trump administration's lack of knowledge, this is my own comment, the lack of knowledge about the reality in that part of the world, and the fact that the UAE in particular was very well informed about the philosophy and the driving, the impressions that drove Trump administration decisions, such as or the simplification that the Muslim Brotherhood is bad, without understanding what the Muslim Brotherhood is in different parts of the world. I have a number of questions you have that all pertain to the potential for mediation by Kuwait, by others. There is a letter that was sent recently from Saudi Arabia to Qatar through the Kuwaitis indicating some interest. There have been a number of false starts, particularly on the Saudi side, that have failed to materialize in terms of really reaching out and mediating, whereas for its part, the UAE has been very consistent. It does not want, it still wants to insist on effectively Qatar capitulation. Any ideas on where this is going, or if it can go?
Well, as you say, there have been attempts to mediate before. In 2017, the Kuwaitis were very active, especially in the first week of the crisis. That critical first 3 or 4 days, Emir Sabah in Kuwait really engaged in a frenetic round of shuttle diplomacy, going to Doha, Abu Dhabi, and Riyadh. And I think, as he himself made clear in September in his press conference, he seems to believe that he at least prevented the crisis from escalating further. And so I think his shuttle diplomacy at the beginning was critical. And just as in 2014, when he also had tried successfully to mediate an end to that iteration of the crisis, he's then since tried to offer his services as well. Sheikh Sabah, of course, is a former Kuwaiti foreign minister of 40 years standing. He is the respected elder statesman of the Gulf. But even Kuwaiti mediation has been unsuccessful. And we saw in 2019, after the attacks on Saudi oil facilities, we saw hopes for at least a thawing of relations between Saudi Arabia and Qatar. So a kind of bilateral thaw, not a thaw between the UAE necessarily. And the Qataris responded to the attack on Aramco by reaffirming the principle of collective GCC security, by reaffirming the notion that an attack on one is an attack on all. The Qataris took part in a chief of staff meeting of GCC chiefs of staff, and they made all the right noises. And that was appreciated, I think, in Riyadh, and certainly the optics around the GCC summit in December 2019 were very different from the summits in Mecca in May 2019, when on that occasion the Qatari Prime Minister was almost frozen out, whereas in December he was welcomed by King Salman. But that didn't go anywhere. The talks that had begun in October, November 2019 eventually fizzled out by January. And it seems that the tone of the Saudi position may have shifted in late November after Mohammed bin Salman spent 4 days in Abu Dhabi with Mohammed bin Zayed. He was there for the Abu Dhabi Formula One Grand Prix, and he was there for the Saudi Emirati Coordination Council meeting. And certainly if you talk to people who, at least the people in Doha, they suggested that the tone shifted, and it could have been that Mohammed bin Zayed and Mohammed bin Salman got together and decided that whatever the issues they may have on other issues like Yemen, Qatar for them is not an issue worth falling out over. Certainly it would have been a coup for the Qataris had they been able to have split the quartet, if they could have peeled Saudi Arabia away. And Egypt and Bahrain may have followed, leaving the UAE as the kind of only holdout. But that didn't happen. So I think it's quite clear now that whatever the different positions of Saudi, the UAE, the relationship between the crown princes is still strong enough that they're on the same page. And so I think that complicates any attempt for resolution that the Kuwaitis or anyone else may have. I mean, passing letters is great because at least it maintains channels of communication and dialogue. But again, also the demands on the different sides for what would constitute a kind of acceptable resolution, I think, are still quite wide. You know, an apology from the Qatari side, some of the demands of 2017 from the Quartet side, perhaps as well. And again, the fact that this happened not just in 2017, but also in 2014, there's a lack of trust from a Qatari point of view. This happened twice in 3 years. Why would they think it might not happen again? And from a blockading state's point of view, they feel that Qatar didn't abide by the 2014 agreement, which is why they had to do what they did in 2017. So you have this lack of trust. And also, I think maybe a feeling that no one side is feeling the pain so much that they have to make the first move. So there's also, I think, an unwillingness to make that first concession. So I think in that respect, it's been stuck for a while.
A number of questionnaires have asked about if you could elaborate a bit more on the reasons that Saudi Arabia and the Emirates have given for the blockade. David Desroches talks about, was the role of Al Jazeera in the confrontation important? Has that evolved since then?
Well, initially there were almost no demands or justification given, which was why there was mystification, I think, in the US, and a degree of frustration, especially in the State Department, in those first 2 weeks. The blockade happened on the 5th of June, and I think on the 21st of June, the State Department spokeswoman, Heather Nauert, came out in public and said, "We don't understand why this action has taken place. There's been no communication of demands, so what do they want from it?" And so, lo and behold, within 2 days, we had that set of 13 demands. It was 2 days after Heather Nauert had stood up at the State Department and said, "We don't know why they're doing this." So one gets the impression that those 13 demands were put together perhaps in haste as an attempt post-event to justify taking action the way they did. And actually mentioning Al Jazeera as, I think, one of the very first demands, that the closure not just of Al Jazeera, but also of other Qatari-owned media outlets, did to some extent backfire, because it then allowed the issue to become a freedom of speech, freedom of media issue as well, which I think New York Times, for example, had an editorial against it. So again, it diluted perhaps the sort of the purity of the message that the blockading states wanted to project, and it contributed to the reframing of that narrative in favor of the sort of Qatari sort of narrative that they were being subjected to a power play. Although together with Al Jazeera, I mean, talking about Al Jazeera, one of the concessions made in 2014 was actually to close the Egyptian affiliate channel of Al Jazeera. The Qataris actually closed it down. So the Qataris have also shown in the past that they are willing to make concessions on issues like Al Jazeera. But the way it was framed in 2017, I think, did more harm to the blockading states than it did to Qatar itself.
Very interesting question, the one that I've had ample opportunity to talk to my Qatari friends about. Qatar has evolved since the blockade began. There have been changes in the law, the repeal of the kafala system, different attitudes towards the resident population. Could you talk a little bit about that, and also your opinion as to whether or not it has had an effect in the neighboring countries?
Yes, to some extent there has been, and one could even argue that not being fully tied to the GCC and being able to be more autonomous in policy making has allowed the Qataris to move further on some issues, such as beginning to rethink the kafala system, a new asylum law, for example, as well, which was unique in the region. Being a little bit freer of that kind of shadow of the GCC has given Qatar more leeway to act in ways that continue to make it more distinct from some of its regional neighbors. And I think certainly from a kind of GCC point of view, the Qataris have now moved further away from what you might call a consensus or a GCC-wide norm on some approaches. We've seen obviously UAE to some extent also beginning to offer long-term residency visas, or kind of residential kind of green card style permits. I mean, the Qataris is certainly not alone, but I think certainly while they were fully sort of signed up member of the GCC in spirit as well as in letter, those would have been maybe harder to push through. And Qatar also, I think, has begun to, certainly some of the language in 2017-18 was very different, in the sense that there was a feeling that we're all in this together. Everyone is affected by the blockade, be they citizens or residents as well. And even the Emir himself talked about residents as well as citizens in a speech he gave to the United Nations General Assembly in 2017. So you began to see, to some extent, an erosion of that rigid boundary between citizens and residents of Qatar, because of course the blockade affected everyone. And so that was quite interesting to see in 2017-18. To some extent it continued, but perhaps obviously its effect got weaker as time went by, as the kind of immediacy of the blockade began to recede. And then, of course, Qatar also in trying to localize more production, especially of food, and perhaps to try and diversify and expand an industrial base. I mean, these were measures that were also part of their Vision 2030 that may have been intended for further down the line, but of course they had to be accelerated in 2017, accelerated because they had to meet immediate needs. And so certainly the Qataris have moved their own way in terms of restructuring trade routes, restructuring supply chains, increasing domestic production, and actually in ways that may be beneficial now with the corona pandemic, which has had precisely that impact on food chains, on supply chains. And the Qataris, because of what happened in 2017, are at least producing a lot more in certain items at home than they were before. So that could be an unintended consequence, that they were forced to become more self-sufficient, which may now ease the kind of the cushion of trying to operate in a kind of a travel and trade disrupted world that we live in today.
Changing path slightly, you mentioned earlier that the United States stance has caused doubt within the Gulf countries if the U.S. will provide support, what our positions are. It appears that President Trump is trying very hard to make good on his promise to get out of the region. Do you have any feel as to who is more worried about that, the Qataris, the Emiratis, the Saudis, or the Iraqis, or even the Iranians? Who is most concerned about in the region about the American announced plan to withdraw, and at least some early steps being taken in that direction, the consolidation of military forces in Iraq, the agreement with the Taliban for us to bail and leave the Taliban to Afghanistan? I'm being a little bit sarcastic here. But anyway, in general, the reaction to the likelihood or the possibility of an American withdrawal, does it vary from country to country?
To some extent, all the Gulf states do still consider the US security and defense partnership to be critical to their external security and stability. I mean, their regional security and stability. I mean, that hasn't changed, and we've seen aspects of that called into question, as I mentioned, in 2017 for Qatar and 2019 for Saudi UAE. I think there's a degree of concern in the Gulf, in the region as a whole, that not just one, but now two successive US presidents have acted in ways that, to a Gulf audience, have called into question that relationship, that partnership. Certainly the Saudis and Emiratis were perhaps so keen to embrace Trump in 2016 when he won the election in November, and then early 2017, precisely because he wasn't Obama, precisely because he was against, or seemed to be against, a lot of what Obama's government had done in the region, especially with the JCPOA. And one could argue that the Saudi Emirati outreach was really almost kind of giddy, in the sense of, we've got a White House that now we think will really kind of follow an approach that aligns with our interests. And of course, that has now shifted quite significantly. So I think the challenge for whatever happens in November and whatever comes next, from a US administration point of view, is throughout the Gulf, I think partners now hedging their bets to some extent. I mean, there's a feeling, I think, there's an acknowledgement that no other country can really replace the US as that kind of backbone of regional stability that the US has provided to regimes over the past 30 years. But a diversification, at least, of kind of defense and security agreements, of arrangements. And again, that's problematic because it leaves a door open for Russia, which from a US perspective is an adversary, and that's problematic from a US perspective. Russia, especially with the UAE and Saudi, has become much closer in terms of some security and even defense relationships. And it's had an issue with China as well. Now, China less so in the security and defense realm, but much more economically. And so it seems that from a US point of view, there's a lack of joined up thinking to some extent, that they may want to try and withdraw from the region, but that opens up doors for other entities to come in, which when they do, draws US ire, especially this Trump administration's ire, when the Russians or the Chinese seek to take advantage or to move in, or when the response to the perceived gap between US and Gulf security interests in 2019 leads to a sudden interest in de-escalation with Iran, which again is significantly out of kilter with what the maximum pressure campaign is supposed to achieve. So it seems as if this is just another part of that lack of perhaps Trump administration's joined up thinking of having one aspects in one policy on one side and then other things happen in consequence, and suddenly they're no longer in alignment with each other.
Speaking of unexpected consequences, as you know, I spent a long time in the Gulf in my diplomatic service, and I always believed, for example, that the UAE had as much apprehension and fear of the Saudis as the Qataris did, and yet they came together in this alliance against Qatar. Now it seems to be fraying at the edges, or worse. The UAE and Saudi Arabia are heading for a proxy confrontation in Yemen. The UAE, it appears, wants southern Yemen to break off. Saudi Arabia has been less and less visible in supporting Haftar than the UAE has. Is the failure of the blockade the reason for the fraying of the relationship between Abu Dhabi and Riyadh, or was it sort of inevitable and all the blockade did was create a brief moment of cooperation and solidarity?
I think any observer of Gulf politics in the 2000s would have predicted that the next split would be between the UAE and Saudi. Throughout the 2000s, there were episodic instances of Saudi-Emirati tension. And ironically, the UAE and Qatar tried to build a kind of a bridge, a causeway. In 2003, that was blocked by the Saudis. And the Saudis also tried their best to block the construction of the pipeline, the gas pipeline, from Qatar to the UAE on both counts, because from a Saudi point of view, anything that allowed the smaller Gulf states to bypass Saudi Arabia was, in their view, something they didn't want to happen. The Saudis, being the only state with borders with all other 5 states, wanted a kind of a hub and spoke system where everything would go through Saudi. So anything that would kind of increase the other Gulf states' ability to bypass Saudi was resisted. And even in 2010, there was a kind of border, kind of not a skirmish per se, but certainly a border point of tension between Saudi and the UAE as well. Of course, the Arab Spring changed that. It kind of drew the Saudis and Emiratis closer together in their resistance to Islamism, to the results of the toppling of long-standing authoritarian status quo, and also I think in their resistance to the notion that Qatar was somehow supporting Islamist groups elsewhere. So they kind of drew them together. Now, as you say, the Saudi-Emirati alignment, I think, will be severely tested over Yemen, where they do support different political groups. They have different threat perceptions as well. For the Saudis, it's a border issue with the Houthis, issue of border security and who controls Sana'a. For the Emiratis, it's more about geopolitical ambitions across the Horn of Africa. And I think the closer we get to an end to the war and to the beginning of a political settlement, or at least a political process, some of those contradictions will become more apparent. They already have, where the STC now ranged against the Hadi government based in Saudi Arabia. I think Qatar and the blockade was not enough of an issue for the Saudis and Emiratis to fall out over, whereas Yemen is. And so perhaps that also may have been a factor in why the attempt in 2019 to have a thaw in relations between Saudi and Qatar didn't go anywhere, because from an Emirati point of view or from a Saudi point of view, you're going to have serious disputes. Let's have it over something that is more central to their sort of regional concern, in terms of actually having a potential blowback on Saudi Arabia or the UAE in Yemen. So I think certainly there's a potential for a split, I just think will happen over Yemen, not over the blockade.
Also relating to other countries in the GCC, very soon after the Qatari blockade, the UAE embarked on a campaign against Oman, particularly targeting Yusuf bin Alawi. And it looked very much like, for a moment there, that the Kingdom and the Emirates together were planning on doing the same thing to Oman that they'd done to Qatar. Was that an Emirati initiative in your perception? Was related, or just whatever happens in that part of the world? The scorpion and the turtle crossing the river aspect of it.
There was certainly a lot of concern, I think, in Oman and among Omani officials that they might be next. I think there was acute awareness that as Sultan Qaboos grew older and with his illness that he had in 2014, 2015, that they were watching very carefully and very closely to see what happened in Qatar, because they were aware that this could happen to them too. And to some extent, there were signs of pressure. And even just over the past week as well, there's been another campaign targeting Yusuf bin Alawi, taking old comments in a recording of a conversation with Colonel Gaddafi in Libya and trying to sort of spin them against Oman in the same way that Qatar in 2017 was portrayed as a sort of threat to regional stability, which is kind of like a Gulf consensus. So we do see some parallels there. And obviously, Oman has had its transition. Sultan Qaboos passed away in January, and Sultan Haitham bin Tariq has taken over. I think there's still concern that there could be some sort of potential pressure, partly because Oman, especially now with the pandemic and the lower price of oil and the dislocation, economic disruption, Oman is now in a much more difficult position. And so were there to be any potential support packages to Oman, they might come with strings attached. I mean, that might reduce the Omani's ability to sort of maneuver between these kind of geopolitical blocks in the region. And Kuwait too. I mean, Kuwait also has a succession on the horizon. I mean, Sheikh Sabah turns 91 in a couple of weeks. And Kuwait also has had issues with Saudi Arabia over the last 5 years, over the neutral zone, the closure of oil fields in the neutral zone. And Mohammed bin Salman actually paid a pretty disastrous visit to Kuwait in September 2018, when a 2-day visit ended up lasting little more than an hour or so and broke up in acrimony. So I think from both other kind of balancing states perspectives, Kuwait and Oman, there's been a degree of concern that this pressure on Qatar might not be a one-off. And we might see this attempt by the sort of two much more assertive regional states to try and repeat a sort of play elsewhere. And certainly that could still happen at some point. Unless, of course, the falling out, if there is one over Yemen, is such that the alignment between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi that has really redefined a lot of regional politics itself gets weakened by any potential fallout from Yemen.
Thank you. Getting towards the end, one last question from the audience, from sort of the grand old man of Gulf American punditry, Dr. John Duke Anthony. How would you explain the Iranian relationship with Qatar, the sharing of, has this been strengthened, weakened by the events, the sharing of the North Dome gas field, South Pars, has been strengthened or weakened by the events?
Well, obviously the Qataris and the Iranians have to have a working relationship. I mean, as you said, they share the largest non-associated gas field in the world, which since 1997 has been the engine of Qatar's economic growth. And so there's a need to have a working relationship, whether you like it or not. And certainly since 2017, the fact that Qatar is now blocked from one side, and its only land boundary closed to Saudi Arabia, it's really forced, to some extent, that relationship to become wider, in a sense, economically especially. Qatar had actually downgraded its political representation in Tehran in 2016 in solidarity with the attack on the Saudi embassy and consulate in Iran in January 2016, again showing how Qatar was fully part of the the GCC consensus over Iran in 2016, it also took part in Saudi-led coalition operations in Yemen too. And so from a point of view of regional alignment, that's another casualty of the blockade. The Qataris have now restored diplomatic relations with Iran to the level they were before 2016. And just by necessity, there's a closer economic relationship, they have to. And I think, again, as the US has tried to contain and isolate Iran, that's run counter to US or at least Trump administration interests. But from a practical point of view, it's a matter of pragmatism and necessity. And of course, the gas field means that they have really to find a modus operandi, regardless of what wider geopolitical pressure they face.
Fantastic. I'm going to close with one last comment in your opinion. I have been predicting that the Gulf crisis would continue unchanged until a black swan event happened, that there was no motivation, no incentive inside in the normal course of GCC politics or the politics of the three countries most involved to find a solution, but that some outside black swan event might provide an opportunity for them to let the dispute die. The black swan event happened. It was COVID-19. It has decimated the economies of all three countries. It's imploded oil prices. You can go on and on as to the damage it has done to the economies and to the societies in all three countries. Didn't do any good at all. Why?
I mean, I also thought that last September's attack on Aramco in Saudi Arabia was the black swan event too, and it certainly should have awoken people's minds that whatever threat you think you face from Qatar, you don't actually face a physical threat like you face from Iran or from militia groups linked to Iran. That should have focused minds about the real nature of the threats to Gulf states, but it didn't eventually lead to a change. And again, COVID-19 should be that black swan event, except that we've seen a continuation of this sort of petty sort of point scoring. We saw Qatar Airways try to repatriate some Bahraini citizens from Iran. The Bahraini government refused to accept them, accused Qatar of trying to intervene in domestic Bahraini affairs. And the fact that Mohammed bin Zayed in Abu Dhabi was willing to telephone or to speak on the phone to Bashar al-Assad in Syria on the 27th of March to discuss COVID-19 and remains unwilling to do the same with the Qataris, to me shows just how stuck this is, and that even something like COVID-19, which doesn't respect geopolitical fault lines, which affects every country, not fully equally, but in certainly similar ways, if even that cannot break through this impasse we've had over the last 3 years, the anniversary is coming up next week, if that can't break through, what can? And I'm at a loss for words. If NBZ can talk to Bashar al-Assad and not talk to the Qataris, then I think we're really stuck. And I think that's the lesson as we approach the anniversary on June the 5th of 3 years since the blockade.
I agree completely. This has been a really enlightening presentation. I look forward to finishing the book, and I recommend it to everyone, to all the listeners. Look at the book. This is an expert of knowledgeable, not just experts gotten acquired a bad name lately. This is a knowledgeable and sophisticated view of the Gulf, extending beyond simply the crisis between the three principal powers of the Southern Gulf. Dr. Ulrichsen, Kristian, I want to thank you very much and thank all our listeners. We had some very good questions. We'll see if we can get to some of them informally later, but they were really very good questions. I wish I'd been able to get to them all. Thank you so much, Dr. Ulrichsen.
Thank you very much.